So on June 25th, 1950, North Korea will invade South Korea. And one thing I just want to point out, to this day, the North Korean people believe that actually South Korea, which was essentially from their perspective a puppet of the Americans, is the one that invaded, and they were just defending themselves. We know from archival information from communist archives that this, of course, is false, that this was just an invasion by North Korea into the South. But even the North Korean troops who were leading the invasion, they were even told that they were responding to a South Korean U.S.-backed invasion. But in any case, June 25th, 1950, North Korea will invade South Korea. North Korea will do very well at first, in a large part because they have tanks. And the United States was so afraid of Syngman Rhee trying to invade North Korea that we didn't give him very good equipment. And we didn't even really give him equipment that was good at stopping tanks. So not only did we not really give him any tanks, we didn't give him any good anti-tank weaponry. There are some Americans who will help participate very early on in the war, firing like World War II bazookas, and they just bounce. The shells just bounce off these tanks. So North Korea is going to do very well because of its advantages in armor. Now, South Koreans, and this was kind of a misunderstanding during the war, I think, on the American perspective, they actually fight pretty strongly against these North Korean forces. And also, they fought more strongly than the North Koreans expected. Also, the North Koreans, one thing they thought was that when they invaded, there would be a popular rising to support them. But the people who would have risen have already been dealt with by the South Korean government, right? So when you put these things together, right, the South Koreans are resisting the North Korean invasion rather fiercely, despite the fact that they don't have good tanks or anti-tank weaponry, and there's no popular rising. That's going to slow down the North Korean advance that will give the United States time to bring this issue to the United Nations. The UN will then intervene, and the United States will basically be named the leader of the UN intervention. And this includes, I believe, 16 other countries. There's a lot of countries that will actually intervene and lead troops, but the bulk of troops will be American troops, and that will be basically in charge of this, but technically we're under UN command. And a lot of troops will be brought in from from Japan to help out to fight these North Korean advance. And you can see on the right American troops who have been brought in from Japan into the port of Pusan. And we often talk about what's called the Pusan Perimeter. And basically what happens, if you look on that map on the left, you can see there's a line showing just how quickly, or I should actually say how slowly, North Korean forces were advancing. It was hoped by Kim Il-sung that they would advance much quicker than this, but they were slowed down for logistical reasons, but also because of some resistance from South Korean and U.S. and later UN forces. And they're eventually stopped at what's called the Pusan Perimeter. And that's in the lower right, the southeastern part of the peninsula. And that's a big deal because one of Korea's major ports, which is near Japan, is Pusan. And that gave the Americans and other UN troops a chance to supply the Koreans and to bring in more troops so that we would be able to hold there. And that perimeter does hold. Once the position is stabilized there, General Douglas MacArthur will order an amphibious invasion of the port of Incheon, which is very close to Seoul. And it was rumored, or it was because the tides are very bad there, it was thought that this would not be successful. But MacArthur was able to pull it off, and this surprised the North Koreans and basically cut off their armies in the south and forced them to run into a hasty retreat. Right, so things, and this occurs in September 1950. Things are thus looking really good for the UN forces and the ROK forces because very quickly they will also retake the capital of Seoul, and they will then be able to push forward. So at this point, things are looking pretty good. However, there are going to be some issues that are going to arise. This is a very confusing war. It's not always clear on what side someone is on. Right? Especially if you're an American soldier, you can't really tell just by looking at someone what side they're on. And of course, this would be true for Koreans as well. And the North Koreans took advantage of this and were very good at infiltrating soldiers into civilian refugee columns. So there would be like a group of civilians who would be refugees who'd be coming down towards the American forces, and the Americans would maybe try and let them through, but then some of those civilians would pull out weapons and start attacking the Americans. So it was very difficult for Americans to know what was going on. Early on, there were cases where American soldiers discovered where North Koreans had captured American soldiers, tied their hands behind their back, and then shot them in the back of the head. And so soldiers were very scared, could not necessarily see the enemy well, and so this resulted in Americans killing, sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose, civilians. And that just happened. That was it's not a pretty thing to talk about, but it's also important to note that Americans were not the only ones who did this. The Republic of Korea was killing large numbers of civilians. There's records of British troops complaining about this and saying, look, I thought we were here to save Korean people and to save this government, but the government is massacring women and children. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as already mentioned, massacred American soldiers. They also massacred civilians as well. So this is a very dirty war. And this is something you could look at, perhaps. It's not an easy thing to look at, but for your paper, this might be something to examine. And in understanding the Korean War and understanding how people write about it, it's very difficult because people sometimes try and focus on something for political purposes. So if you're a Korean author who is critical of the American impact on your country's history, you tend to emphasize, oh yes, these Americans, they killed large numbers of civilians. In contrast, if you're part of a Korean who believes the Americans, or an American who believes that Americans had a positive influence on Korea, you want to kind of minimize these while also emphasizing how North Korea also killed large numbers of civilians. In any case, like I said, this happened. It's not easy to study, but it might be something of interest. But one thing we have to also understand is the nature of this war was that this was a Korean civil war in which foreign countries intervened. And it really was a war over what Korea would be. And you had, as we'll see, especially as we talk about North Korea, there were differing visions of what Korea should be. Right? Should it be a bourgeois, middle-class kind of place that's aiming to be like the United States, or should it be a place for the proletariat that's aiming to be like the Soviet Union? And in this kind of deep ideological warfare, even though these are fellow Koreans, they're a threat because they want to create a Korea that doesn't include you. Right? So the Soviet Koreans who are more communist-oriented want to create a Korea in which the proletariat, the workers, the farmers dominate. Whereas the Koreans who are more on the right want to make one where it is focused more on capitalism, on the middle class. And so it's bloody business, unfortunately. But it is, like I said, something you can work on if you have the stomach to do that. In any case, the Americans and the Republic of Korean forces will engage in what's called the race to the Yalu. The Yalu River is what divides China from Korea. There's this effort to roll back North Korea to finally unify Korea as one country under the Republic of Korea, though there are some very complex diplomatic arguments about this. But that's essentially what's going on in this time period. And they're in such a rush that they allow their forces to become divided, to become disorganized. There's this push, let's get the boys back home in time for Christmas. And they actually are going to celebrate Thanksgiving during this race to the Yalu. And so they're just not being cautious. They're emphasizing speed over defense. And this optimism and even kind of denial leads the American generals in charge, especially General Douglas MacArthur, to ignore the signs that China will probably intervene in the war. Right? China does not want an anti-communist United Korea on its doorstep, doesn't want it as a neighbor. And so what will happen is the UN forces, ROK, US forces, will continue racing north and will become, like I said, disorganized, divided, and then they'll be hit by a huge number of Chinese, right? There's going to be this massive Chinese intervention, which will just throw back in disorder, in rapid retreat, sometimes routes of these UN American ROK forces. And one thing I have to emphasize, I think is fascinating, is in many ways American forces did not perform well in the Korean War. The initial American forces had some problems, And our generals just absolutely messed this up big time. And so what's curious is how we have taken this, what I would argue is a strategic defeat, and in some cases tactical defeats, where basically the Chinese, we want a piece of territory. The Chinese say, nope, you can't have it, and they kick us out, which I would call a Chinese victory. But Americans have kind of tried to look back at the past and tried to find some stories that could rescue this and kind of turn this, what I think is defeat, into a victory. And one example of this is what's called the frozen Chosin. There's this area called around the Chosin Reservoir where American forces, particularly some Army, but also in particular U.S. Marines, are going to fight very heroically against the Chinese. And even though they will be pushed back, they will inflict huge numbers of casualties on the Chinese and will retreat in good order. They don't rout, right? They pull back in a fighting withdrawal. And so this story has kind of become this kind of, changing this kind of defeat into a victory. And there's some very interesting materials on this. There's a documentary that our library owns about this, and this might be something interesting to analyze, to look at how this has been turned from a defeat into a victory, even though, like I said, I would argue it's a defeat. Now, the United States had been using the bombings of North Korea during its attacks previously, but we will use our air power to try and halt the Chinese advance, and this eventually does work. We will also bomb over and over again North Korea. I believe we actually dropped more bombs on North Korea than we did during World War II in the Pacific, just to give you a sense of just how many bombs we drop on this tiny land area. And this will kill a large number of people. And we have to keep this in mind whenever we want to understand North Korean anti-U.S. feeling. There's a reason why there's some anti-U.S. feeling there, and that does play a role in how North Korea views Japan or views the United States. And that might be something interesting too to look at in the time period. How is the American bombing of the North Korea, how is that being treated in the media? That might be something interesting to look at. Something else is in the media as well were the accusations that the United States was engaged in biological warfare. And there was this argument by the Chinese and North Koreans that we were using biological warfare in the war. These were just lies. They were false, completely false. The Americans did not use biological warfare. And so that's why you notice I've inserted the word not on this pamphlet. This is just something that drives me nuts because we didn't use it, but there's this kind of claim that we did. It's been completely debunked. But that's also something you could look at, right? There are some resources on this and looking at these accusations that we had done this thing, which, like I said, we didn't do. We did bomb the heck out of the country, but they were conventional weapons. And I would just point out, some people may look at me and say, well, you're naive. If the Americans were willing to use bombs, of course they'd be willing to use biological weapons. I'm like, no, they wouldn't. The Americans were very much against the spread of biological warfare, in part because it was cheap. And so we didn't want other countries that were poor to have access to effective weapons. So we were very much against biological warfare. And that's actually one reason why the United States shut down its offensive biological warfare program, because we didn't want such things to be developed. And also, the problem with using biological warfare is it can come back and hit you, right? Once germs start spreading, you can't necessarily protect your own soldiers. It's much better to use conventional bombs. They're expensive, but we can pay the price financially. And, they're not going to turn around and hurt us in a way biological warfare would. But like I said, it's false, but you could always look at this false claim during this time period. Now, by 1951, there's essentially a stalemate in Korea where the basically in order to dislodge either side would require a commitment of many more forces, right? So the United States, theoretically, we could expand the war, but no one really wants that at home. The Soviet Union, though not publicly involved, does not want escalation. China does not want escalation. So there's an agreement that there should be an armistice to kind of put an end to the fighting, at least for now. The armistice talks proceed very slowly, right? Like very slowly, like from 1951 to 1953. An armistice eventually signed in 1953. Basically, Stalin wanted to draw this war out as long as possible to keep the United States busy, and it wasn't costing him anything. It was costing the North Koreans and China especially, so he was fine with it continuing. So he used pressure to basically have this thing drag on, And basically what forced them to finally sign it was that Dwight D. Eisenhower said basically, I'm going to just start, escalating this war using bombing campaigns outside North Korea was the threat. If you guys don't end this thing, and that eventually leads it to be over. And while the United States, China, and the Soviet Union are fairly content with the armistice, the Koreans aren't happy about it because they want it to be fought to the finish. They want this thing to be done, right? The great powers did not want escalation. We can live with division. This is fine, right? We just divide Korea, right? We got a pro-communist side. We got an anti-communist side. Okay, China doesn't have to live with a united anti-communist country on its doorstep, but also the United States, we can protect Japan because, hey, we've got a anti-communist South Korean government that is a buffer between the communists and Japan, so we can live with that. And this is just sad. I mean, in a sense, especially if you're Korean, right? Koreans did not enter this war in hopes of having a divided country. They entered the war because they wanted a unified country. And it's important to understand this if you want to understand the perspectives of North and South Korea and their kind of frustration, right? They went into the war looking for something else. And because the Syngman Rhee refused to sign it, and as I said before, no peace treaty, the war is still technically on, even to this day. Incidentally, North Korea has repeatedly renounced the armistice and said that they don't have to abide by it, that we can shoot at each other if we want right now, which is not a pleasant thought. Now, one thing that did lead this armistice to drag on was the fact that there was kind of an issue with the Geneva Convention and prisoners of war. So the Geneva Convention requires that prisoners of war be returned to their home country, right? And the idea of that is just to make sure they get to go home. But the problem was that a lot of them didn't want to go to their home country, right? In particular, a lot of Chinese soldiers did not want to go back. They would have preferred to go to Taiwan because they were not pro-communist. They were anti-communist, but been forced to fight. And you also had cases where there were South Koreans, essentially, and even some North Koreans who were not pro-communist, who had been forced to fight for North Korea. They did not want to go back. And this created a huge issue because, I want to really stress here, the vast majority of people who didn't want to go back were people who didn't want to go back to the communist countries. So the communists insisted, hey, we got to follow the letter of the law. And they have a point there. I mean, that is the rule. But for humanitarian reasons, right, the United States and the Republic of Korea are kind of like, yeah, but we don't really want to send these guys back because what's going to happen to them, right? And they don't want to go back. We don't want to force these people to go back when they don't want to. So this was a serious issue. And of course, they realized it was a propaganda victory for them. I mean, if people are choosing not to go back to a communist country, that makes the anti-communist countries look better. And so this was one thing that led to a delay, and it was eventually decided to let them go back to where they wanted to go. Incidentally, and this is an example of Syngman Rhee just doing whatever he wants. He just released a bunch of them. He basically just had the guards open the gates. He had a bunch of people who didn't want to go back to North Korea, a bunch of Koreans who didn't want to go to North Korea. He had made sure they were in the same prison area. And then he just had his guards basically open the gates so they could just leave. And then he just refused to go out and try and recapture them. So that's what I mean about Syngman Rhee. He did what he wanted. The United States, we had actually had a plan to try and overthrow him. And then we decided that, well, if we got rid of the guy, we couldn't find anyone else that would be better than him. So we just got to live with him. On the other side of the coin, while the vast majority of people who didn't want to go back to their home country were Koreans and Chinese who did not want to go back to communist Korea or communist China, there were a number, not a very big number, of American POWs who did not want to go back to the United States, who wanted to go to a communist country. And they are kind of interesting to look at, and there are records on them. I don't think anyone's looked at them in too serious of a way, so that might be an interesting perspective. And you can see they're being used here for propaganda. It says, we stay for peace, right? And one thing also this image points to us is you can see there's an African-American man there with the white soldiers. And what had happened was the Korean War is the first war in which we have a desegregated army. World War II was segregated. Now, desegregation is complicated because sometimes it seems like the question is at what level were the units integrated? Like it seems to me, and I'm not an expert on this level area, but there were, for example, mostly black platoons, right? So you would maybe have a white platoon and a black platoon, but some cases, and that's a very low level. I think a platoon's only 16 soldiers. But you did have much more integration that you had during World War II, and it's enough that we can say there is integration. And so a couple things you can look at. First of all is just looking at the how integration was covered, looking at how people remembered this. And especially if you want to look at from the African American perspective, there are several books that are primary sources giving this African American perspective. And the man that's in that picture, his daughter wrote his, basically edited his kind of memoirs together so you can see his perspective. And by the way, he eventually returned to the United States because it's a long story, but things were going really crazy in China during this period we call the Cultural Revolution. And he realized if he didn't leave China, something terrible might happen to him and his family. And he was probably right. So he left China and came back to the United States and opened a chop suey restaurant because he was a really good cook. And so looking at his perspective and comparing it with a African-American perspective that did not decide to go to China, right? That might be interesting, right? So this is an issue that I think has been understudied that you could certainly look at, and there are the sources there. And in general, the whole issue of prisoners of war might be worth looking at because there is the American soldiers often did not behave well as prisoners, often broke the rules of conduct. There were rules you were supposed to follow if you were taken prisoner. There was a lot of misbehavior, unfortunately, among American soldiers. And in particular, what's interesting is that there were these attempts to, use the language of the time, to brainwash American soldiers by the communists, right? So the communists tried to indoctrinate American soldiers. And there has been a fairly recent book on this. I don't think the book's very good, and that creates an opportunity. So if you want to look at this issue, you could look at American POWs, and especially how they were covered in the press, and there was even like some government hearings about them. So there's certainly primary sources to look at, and I don't think those primary sources have been used effectively. And what's also interesting is how what you can see there, that is a Catholic priest, and he's performing mass on the hood of a Jeep, and that's his acolyte there that's helping him to perform mass. When you do a mass, usually, I mean, you can do it alone if you have to, but ideally you have one other person so you can do the calls. There's parts where the congregation should respond to what the priest says. And what's interesting, this man's name is Father Emo Capon, and he has been used as kind of a heroic figure to argue, I think in a sense, because what happens is he becomes a prisoner and he basically sacrifices his life to help American POWs. So it's where you have all these American POWs behaving badly, and at the same time you have this kind of celebration of this guy as a hero, right? And it kind of counteracts that, helps us kind of replace that memory of these bad American POWs with one of, oh, but there was this guy like Father Capon. Now I have to warn you that if you do want to study him, you have to be very, very careful that your paper does not become just hero worship, right? When I've had students try and write about him before, they just try and talk about how awesome he is. I'm like, no, you can't do that. This is not, the place to do that. I think the guy personally was awesome, and I wrote an article on him, but it was a critical history article. It was not an attempt to celebrate him. It was an attempt to use him as a way of understanding what was going on in Korea and in the Cold War and so forth in this time period. So he is someone you could maybe study, but you got to be very careful about how to do that, and you have to be prepared to do a lot of research. So just keep that in mind. So I do need to say something about the casualties, so just so you can understand just how devastating this war was. China lost about 150 to 400,000 dead. It maybe was even more. They didn't keep good track, and they also tried to minimize casualty figures for propaganda reasons. The UN forces probably lost about 40,000 dead. About 2.5 million Korean civilians, about 2.5 million soldiers died. That's on both sides. Korea only had a population of about 30 million. So that means 1 out of every 6 Koreans died in this war for basically nothing, because nothing changed. I mean, I can't say that the lives of 5 million people would be worth unifying the country, but at least if the country had been unified, you could say that something happened. But basically things just go back to the way they were. And so this is kind of the great tragedy of Korea. And you just really have to keep in mind, I think, and this is difficult to do, Koreans are going to be much more emotional about the Korean War, and it really touches them more deeply than Americans in many ways. to us, this is more of a side note, but to them, this is the main thing. And so this is going to create a lot of feeling. This is something that they're very much interested in. And so it's something you have to keep in mind when you're trying to understand Koreans who are talking about these issues, or if you try and write from the Korean perspective. So in general, when I tell students what the topic of this course is, there's a tendency to think, oh, I could do something on the Korean War. And it's not something I recommend, because if you're going to do it, you got to do a lot of research, right? If you're going to do it, you got to do it right. That means doing a lot of research, because there are a lot of books about the Korean War. And it's interesting, and never ever start your paper by talking about the Korean War as the Forgotten War, because everyone does that, and it drives me nuts, because it's clearly not the Forgotten War, because people keep writing about it. So don't do that. So I have to stress that. In many ways, it's been overstudied, especially the military aspects. Now, there are opportunities because of the problematic handling of some things. Like, so for example, I talked about the prisoners of war. There is a book on that. But to write about the prisoners of war, you would have to A, read the book, and then B, read a large number of primary sources so you can challenge the book. Could you do that? Yes, you could. But be prepared to spend a huge amount of time doing it. So unless you've got, if you're taking like 12 hours and you're not working and you've got that time, that's great. But if you're taking a full load of like 15 hours and you've got a job or something like that, do not do that. That would be not a good idea. So it is possible, but you just got to be ready to do a lot of research, because there's a lot written about it. For example, about Father Capon, I believe there's 2 to 3 articles just on him alone, for example, that you would have to master, as well as reading a couple books of primary sources dedicated to him. One thing I think that can work are how are particular events viewed in U.S. newspapers. That might be interesting, might be possible. You could look at what particular policy an American might argue for and why, and how did he or she make that argument. One example is also look at how our particular events remembered and presented and why, and that's kind of like the Chosin documentary I talked about. You could become like an expert, and this would still require a lot of reading, right, on the Chosin Reservoir campaign, and then compare that to how the veterans are remembering it and how it's being presented. That might work as well, and then what that leads to. So like I said, you could do these things, but it requires a very large amount of research, and you have to be prepared to do that. One thing that I think, though, is really understudied is how early, like in the 1950s even when the war was going on, there were all these Americans writing about the war, trying to figure it out, and trying to argue for particular policies. And that's something you could look at, right? That would require, again, you'd have to read their entire book. That's one book. And then read some more material so you really understand the Korean War, and especially the events they're talking about, so you can challenge them. It is possible. So you can do the Korean War if you're interested in it, but you got to be prepared to do a huge amount of research, right? And I can't stress that enough.